Folks, this is the Cole Memo. I am your host, Cole Preston. Every episode is released in audio, video, and transcript format. To find the transcript, audio, or video version of any episode, please refer to the description of the episode that you're listening to now. Within that description, you can find a link that will take you to our website, which will display the transcript for this episode and the platforms where you can find this episode in audio or video formats. If you're unable to locate the episode description on whichever platform you're listening from, simply note the episode number and visit thecolememo.com. From there, you can find the corresponding episode, and then you'll be able to access the audio, video, or transcript version of that episode. You might also find any links that we reference during the episode so that you might be able to do your own research. If you're not listening to this episode of the Cole Memo on Patreon, then you're listening to this episode later than our patrons. To become a patron, go to thecolememo.com/Patreon. Once again, that's thecolememo.com/Patreon. It's a great way to support our show. It only costs $3 a month, and it allows you to get exclusive access to our episodes as they release. But one of the best ways to support our show is absolutely free. Subscribe to or follow our show. Leave us a positive review from wherever you're listening to us from. Favorite this episode, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, or post a review. Your engagement and support is appreciated. Today is January 2nd, 2024. Enjoy this episode of The Cole Memo. Jeremy, thank you for sitting back down with me. Last time we spoke, I was hosting the Chillinois podcast. I've since changed show names, so welcome to The Cole Memo. In case people don't know who you are, do you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, my name's Jeremy Gorner. I'm a reporter with the Chicago Tribune. I cover state government and state politics. I'm based out of the Illinois Capitol in Springfield.
Awesome. And yeah, so once again, you can find Jeremy's work in the Chicago Tribune. We'll actually be referencing one story that I'll have linked, and then we'll take a deep dive into a different story that we've talked about in the past. Happy New Year, though. First, I just wanted to
Yeah,
say,
you
Jeremy.
too. You too. And congratulations on the image change. I mean, I'm sure um uh yeah, what were the reasons for that? What prompted the makeover?
Well, many different reasons, but the main reason I'd say is so that I could branch out. But one of the reasons, if I could just be candid with, like, especially with a person like you, like, I reach out to a reporter like you or somebody else who's highly regarded, and they'd see the Chillinois podcast and my
Mhm.
logo, and they'd be like, well, do I really want to like risk my career or reputation going on this show? And so I feel that this gives it a more professional look. And if you didn't know, Jeremy, the Cole Memo is, I like to tell this for our audience so they can do a little bit of learning.
Yeah.
Um, the Cole Memo is actually not just a cheesy reference to my name. It's actually a reference to federal policy that began in the Obama era. It is
Mm,
the reason that adult use
right.
cannabis is allowed to go on state by state.
Okay. Right, right,
So
right.
it
Okay.
just happens to be convenient that my name is in it as well.
Right, right, right. No, that's perfect. Probably I mean I don't know. I mean I didn't have a problem with your old name, but imagine had you had this been your original name, imagine all the policy wonks you would who would have
Yeah.
who would have latched on earlier, perhaps. I mean, who knows?
Right. And
But
that's that to your point. That's what I love about this name. The policy wonks will get it right away, and other people, it's vague enough to where I can basically talk about anything and everything. And
yeah,
to that point, we'll kind of be all over the map, at least for the beginning of this show. 2014, a new year means new laws.
right.
And I think that kind of segues us into one of our main stories that I wanted to discuss today. How do you want to break this down, Jeremy?
Yeah, I mean, so there's so Cole. I mean, there's been, there were more than 300 new state laws that went into effect yesterday, January 1st. And as I've said in our story, as Dan Petrella, my cohort, and I said in our story yesterday, these new laws range from everything from education to criminal justice to employee benefits to a ban on indoor vaping. And these are basically, the priorities that are reflective of Governor J.B. Pritzker and his Democratic allies in the Democratic controlled legislature. So like first and foremost, probably the most talked about new law is the assault weapons ban registry. Basically what this is by yesterday, if you if you are an Illinois resident who owned any of these more than 100 or so high-powered semi-automatic rifles, handguns, or shotguns that are deemed assault weapons under the new assault weapons ban that went into effect last year, you had until yesterday to, if you had own these weapons prior to the law going into effect last January 10th, you could still keep those weapons. However, you have to register them through the Illinois State Police, and you have to register, and you had to register them uh, by yesterday, January 1st. Basically, what the statute says is that if you are found to be in violation of this, it's a misdemeanor for a first offense, and subsequent offenses, you could be charged with a felony. I mean, I've been, paying attention to some of these hearings that have been going on about, from concerned residents about, how this registry is going to be enforced. There were concerns that, some of the rules put into place by the state police, per the state law, were kind of vague. How is this going to be put into place? And one of the lawyers for the state police made it clear at these hearings that enforcement could vary from county to county. It could be up to the county how they want to prosecute it, if they want to prosecute it. But you know it it would be interesting to see what happens with this, because as we've seen with bail reform, I mean, lack of registering a gun, the fine line between registering and not registering an assault weapon, which could mean the fine line between what's legal and illegal. Like, we don't know, it's not a violent crime, so it's not like it would be a detainable offense, especially with misdemeanors, with a misdemeanors, but still, the law's the law. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of compliance we get with this, because we've seen, I don't know if you've been paying attention, Cole, earlier this year, on January 10th of last year, when the assault weapons ban went into effect, um, something like 90 out of the Illinois' 102 county sheriffs basically said they weren't going to enforce this ban, including the registry. And there was a lot of paranoia that the police are going to come door to door to see if gun owners are in compliance with this, which isn't going to happen. But it'll be, I think what we're gonna see in the coming weeks is, really, this is going to be a true test, I think, for the state police, and I think for state officials, just to see how this is going to be enforced. And in addition to that, I mean, the assault weapons ban itself is being litigated through the courts at the right now on the federal level. So far, Pritzker and Attorney General Kwame Raoul have been successful in staving off legal challenges from gun rights groups who believe that the assault weapons ban itself is unconstitutional, violates the Second Amendment. And of course, the assault weapon ban registry is part of that. But the way that it's shaping up right now, Cole, it could go up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And a lot of gun rights advocates are very hopeful of that because of, as you know, the Supreme Court is a 6-3 conservative majority. A handful of them appointees of former President Trump, who obviously, very pro Second Amendment. So we'll see what happens with that.
Yeah, and different states are doing this too, right? Illinois is not alone. Isn't California another one that is
Yeah, California, Delaware, Maryland, Illinois is, like, I believe, the ninth, or about or about that of
so so you're
along with
saying one
the
way or another
District
they're
of
hope
Columbia. Mhm.
oh, gotcha. District of Columbia too.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting because you're just bringing up your point about the states, is that the thing that we keep hearing from Governor Pritzker is a renewed call for a federal assault weapons ban, which we had for 10 years, from 1994 till 2004. And he's obviously, but in this day and age with such a divided Congress, I mean, we that's probably not going to happen. But he's also somebody who Pritzker, of course, has really branded himself as among his issues that he's really pushed forth, of course, being, for pro-abortion rights, for example, and all about criminal justice reform. And after what, the deadly mass shooting in Highland Park, he's also become a gun control advocate himself. So of course, that's going to be something he's going to champion. But I don't know if a federal assault weapons ban appears realistic at this time. But but the state ban is definitely something that's within his control.
Yeah. And have you seen recent like compliance rates? Do we keep track of
Yeah.
compliance rates?
So let me pull them up
Sure.
right here. This is what I think I want to stress for this is really what I want to stress, for your audience here, is that you know the so here, okay, so there's 2.4 million um uh, FOID card holders in Illinois. A FOID card is a firearm owner's identification card. That is what Illinoisans must have in their possession in order to own a firearm in the state of Illinois. So there's 2.4 million people who have these cards, 2.4 million of these cards issued. And of that 2.4 million, um, those 2.4 million FOID card holders, there have been 29,357 people who have registered either a gun that is deemed an assault weapon or an accessory to a gun deemed an assault weapon. So the state police website has a portal where that requires owners of these grandfathered in guns to register their guns. So I mean, just to so just to say, so basically, you know, uh, just to kind of do the math here. Um, uh, yeah. So just to kind of do the math here, you have just over 1% of all FOID card holders in Illinois have registered either a gun deemed an assault weapon or an accessory to those guns. Now, the question is like, does that mean that people just aren't following the law? Well, I want to stress to your listeners, we don't know. And this is why this is important, because just because you are a FOID card holder in Illinois, that doesn't mean that you own a gun. And just because you are a FOID card holder in Illinois, if you own a gun, that doesn't necessarily mean you own a gun that is deemed an assault weapon. So we truly don't have an exact accounting of how many of these banned weapons should be grandfathered in, that where there's non-compliance. Now, we've seen a lot of pro Second Amendment folks in Illinois say that they are not going to follow, this gun ban registry. Probably, in the last 24 hours, if you've been paying attention to social media, Darren Bailey, the former gubernatorial candidate who lost to Pritzker in the last election, Bailey, Republican from southeastern Illinois, basically put out he basically put out an image of his depicting his home where he's sitting at a table doing a puzzle and a couple of long guns that are basically laid out there, and he's saying, I'm not going to comply. That's so, and there's a lot of people who feel that way about this law, who are really pro gun rights. So that's the thing. But get still, we don't know, that 1% that I mentioned, we don't know how many people in this state own guns that should be registered.
Yeah, yeah. It's like we're just the sound. So it sounds like the compliance rate is just basically seeing of the number of total FOID card holders, comparing it to the number of people that have registered either a weapon that qualifies under this ban, or like you say, an accessory that qualifies under this ban. What was the percentage you said again?
It
Given
was
that,
just over one. It was just over 1% of all
wow.
FOID card holders.
Well, and then the other element that I think is important to consider I know that you're very well aware of it, and we've talked about it, so I'm, somewhat aware of the developments and such, but I gotta wonder how many people in Illinois are actually keenly aware of these details and what's required.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of been so that's been it's so interesting you bring that up, Cole, because that's kind of been an issue, especially for downstate residents. I mean, I heard a question that was asked at a press conference about people who live in rural communities who don't have access to, broadband, internet. How are they gonna, because you have to go online to register. You have to go through an online portal through the Illinois State Police. So, I mean, not to be an apologist, not to make excuses or anything like that. Of course, I'm just telling you, just based on reporting and from talking to people, that this is what I'm gathering. But what you said, is a legitimate issue with some folks. But I think what Attorney General Raoul's staff will say, because they've argued this in court, is that um, constitutionally, they have satisfied their requirement to notify the public about the registry. And here's why. I mean, so January 10th of 2023, that's when Pritzker signs the assault weapons ban into law. And if you read the statute, it pretty clearly spells out that beginning on October 1st of 2023, um, Illinoisans who own these guns have to fill out what's called a so-called endorsement affidavit, which is a fancy way of saying they have to register their gun with the state police. But that's kind of a legalese term well, I mean, that's what state police is calling it, and that's how it's written in the statute. That process began October 1st and ended, yesterday, January 1st. Um, and Basically and in that, those numbers I gave you were a reflection of the percentage of total FOID card holders in Illinois who registered their grandfathered in banned guns from October 1st until yesterday, basically. So my point is that on January 10th of last year, it was codified into law that you had to register these guns between October 1st and January 1st. That's number one. Number two, there were 3 public hearings about concerns regarding the assault weapons ban registry, beginning in September or September, October. It was in the fall, basically. There was one in downstate Caseyville. There's one in Chicago, one in Springfield. And there you basically had gun rights advocates kind of airing out their concerns about this registry, saying it's vague on, what kind of, as far as like some of the gun attachments that they have to register, like what constitutes a flash suppressor or a pistol grip. The definitions that they give could be different, aren't clear enough to some people. Like that was one concern. And then another concern too that was raised by by Republican lawmakers, is that, when it comes to owning a gun, gun rights advocates, what they value is data privacy. Like they're not, like the government does not keep track, does not keep like a registry of what kind of guns they're, or like ATF doesn't keep track of what kind of guns, people own. Like they don't have like a master registry like that. What they do have, of course, they can access, the 4473 forms that you would fill out when you go to a federally licensed firearm dealer. And ATF, agents could do that, but there's no, like, by and large, there's data privacy when it comes to firearm ownership. And by having to report what guns you own to the state police, some folks feel that goes against that. You know what I mean? So, of course, another question is, if this law is deemed unconstitutional in the courts, what's the state police going to do with all that data? So that's another thing they're sorting out. But anyhow, I'm going off on a tangent here. My point is that the state law, when it was signed into law by Pritzker January 10th, spells out, that a registry, it does exist. And number two, after that, in the fall, there were public hearings about that. So my point is that Attorney General Raoul, he and his staff believe that they've given the public ample notice about this, and they've fulfilled their constitutional duties by informing the public the way they have. Might not be considered adequate by a lot of people, especially pro Second Amendment folks who are not in favor of the assault weapons ban. But Raul's staff is pretty adamant saying that they've done their job in notifying the public.
Yeah. Yeah, I bring that up just to add I felt like a layer of nuance to what you were saying, which is that, some people might be out and vocal saying, I'm not registering my guns,
Yeah.
to the government. But some people, I don't know, like you said, living under a rock. I mean, some people truly do. So
Yeah.
but to your point, I get what you're saying. But I like I say, I bring that up just to, it's an extra layer of like I say, nuance to one of the points I think you were making. And another thing I just actually read the other online to another point you brought up with regard to just having a registry in general is the privacy concerns that people have with database leaks becoming a normal
Yeah.
thing, So I just that's an interesting thought that I didn't even think of. I read that a concern the other day and I was like, oh, I didn't even think about the fact that yeah, that database could be breached, if we don't have the highest security protocols or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, the federal government, if they really want to, if they're doing like an investigation into gun trafficking
Hmm.
or gun running, or you know, um, for example, or like any kind of gun crimes, I mean, they can have access to the 4473 forms that one has to fill out to buy a gun at like a gun shop, for example. There's a lot of states though that don't keep track of private sales, from you know as far as like just regular everyday people selling a gun to another everyday person. I mean, there's laws that I think where they have to keep records for X amount of years, but there's no registry that you know that reflects all that keeps track of all that. But I guess what you're bringing up too is that what one of the things that came out at the hearings in regards to data privacy is that there was a question about you know, so there's a thing called the leads database. I don't know if you're familiar with the leads database or so the leads database is basically it's a very commonly it's administered by the state. It's commonly used by law enforcement agencies within the state of Illinois. So law enforcement, like if they pull you over for a traffic stop, they can run your name and leads to see what your criminal history is, if you're wanted for any crimes, etc. And one of the things that law enforcement has records of whether somebody they're doing a background check on or a search or they're doing a search on rather um in the database, they could tell whether they have a FOID card or not. So the state police's argument was basically, so like some of the legislative Republicans were saying, well, it's kind of, we're concerned about, you know, the fact that the database leads database could also say, yeah, this person, owns these guns, registered them with the state police under, these person actually own assault weapons. They are legally registered with the state police. And, Republicans were expressing concerns that gun owners might be a little iffy about that. And the state police has come back and said that this is really no different than, a police officer knowing right off the bat that you are a FOID card holder. This is just a little more information to show like, okay, what kind of guns do they have? That they legally registered in the system. But nonetheless, this goes back to my point about, how gun rights advocates are concerned about data privacy, basically. And that's basically, that would be kind of the that would be the clearinghouse, if you will, for some of this data would be in like the leads database or a comparable law enforcement database used by you know police in Illinois.
Yeah. Any other bases we haven't covered just on the latest developments with this? I've got like one more question and you've kind of already touched on it. But I just wanted to ask, give you the space. Was there anything else that we haven't touched on with regard to this new gun law, firearm law?
Nothing that specifically that I could think of that specifically went into effect yesterday,
Okay.
New Year's Day, but like obviously just the ban also applies to magazines. So like for example, in addition to the sale, import, purchase of these high powered guns, Um, also included in the ban are high capacity magazines. And the way high capacity magazines are defined is that anything more than 10 rounds for a long gun, or 50, anything more than 15 rounds for a handgun. So those are also subject to the assault weapons ban.
Gotcha. It's so, like I said, you had already kind of addressed this question, but just to put a bow on this topic before we skip
Mm-hmm.
to new laws that are going
Sure.
into effect, what is next? When's the next hearings? When might it go to the Supreme Court? But I don't know. Just get kind of what does it look like will occur? I mean, of course, these are
Yeah.
predictions, but
Yeah. So I mean, it's really so. I wish I had a list in front of me to show you how many legal challenges they've been. Like, I unfortunately don't have it memorized chapter and
sure.
verse, like when the next hearings are for these cases. But what it's been expressed to me, like, so right before Christmas break, um, a federal judge in Southern Illinois denied a motion from gun rights advocates, um, who requested a preliminary injunction, basically to temporarily halt the registry from going into effect January 1st. Basically, that was denied by a federal judge. The same federal judge who initially granted an injunction, if you recall, the assault weapons ban was overturned for a brief time because this same judge, through an injunction, said it was likely unconstitutional. That decision was overturned by a panel in the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals here in Chicago. And so one of the other things the gun rights folks tried to do was get, basically siphon out the registry from the ban itself to try to get an injunction on that, and the judge wouldn't go for that. So basically what's next is, in the next couple of months, you're gonna see both sides, the gun rights advocates and Attorney General Raul's staff, basically argue on the merits of the assault weapons ban itself. And, you know, that could be subject to, whatever judges, federal judges, on the district level in Illinois rule there, you know, that could be appealed, subject to appeals from either side, whatever side is, um, doesn't is on the losing end of some of these initial legal challenges, and before you know it, it probably could go up to the U.S. Supreme Court in the coming months. So that's
Yeah.
kind of where we're at right now. We're really in the appeals process for several of these legal challenges. I mean, there's a legal challenge out there too by uh by state rep Dan Calkins. He's a Republican from Decatur.
Mhm.
um so there was also a separate pathway to basically overturn the ban through the Illinois Supreme Court, and that failed. But Calkins, of course, was making made some news and emotion by saying that, alleging that a couple of the judges who voted to keep the assault weapons ban in place were actually recipients of some big donations from Governor Pritzker when they, ran for their seats. So Calkins is appealing, the state Supreme Court's ruling to the U.S. Supreme Court, which I mean, a lot of one gun control advocate I talked to, who's a lawyer, said doesn't think that has a good chance. Didn't really seem like there's really grounds for an appeal like that, but that's what we're going to see next. I mean, that's among the legal challenges that, the U.S. Supreme Court is going to field or not, or decide not to field. We'll see.
And that's kind of what I was going to ask. Is the end game here in the United States Supreme Court? Is that where this?
Probably.
Yeah.
I think that's probably safe to say. I mean, as of right now, I mean, because I mean, both sides are fighting tooth and nail. You have, Attorney General Raul and Governor Pritzker. I mean, because of what happened in Highland Park, are fighting tooth and nail to keep this in place. They're very confident that the law is constitutional, especially since other states have passed their own bans. But, you have the gun rights advocates who are very passionate that they think that they violated the Second Amendment. And, in the times that we're in, they probably feel more emboldened to keep fighting this law, especially with the makeup of the Supreme Court, of the U.S. Supreme Court as we see it today.
Yeah. And I'm asking this because I hear it thrown around a lot by people on the rights of firearms, and I'm just curious as a reporter if you've ever heard a response to people saying, Chicago has the strictest gun laws in the nation, yet it has a really huge problem with firearms in the city. Have you ever heard anybody address that idea? In other words, they're saying, how's a ban going to help, type of thing.
Well, I mean, I think one thing to look at, is I think it's kind of tricky, but if I were, I would like to look and see like what kind of guns are being recovered from the streets of
Mm,
Chicago at crime
yeah,
scenes.
yeah.
And if um and if some of these guns are, if these are guns that are indeed banned under state law for legal gun owners, then it kind of makes you then it kind of makes you wonder, if these are these guns had to have come from somewhere. They had to have
Hmm.
come from gun shops that aren't supposed to be selling these guns, so how did they get out on the street? But I think that it's going to be a while, but because this ban, like I said, this ban, it hasn't even been a year yet.
Yeah.
Just went into place before we can draw that conclusion as to the effectiveness, of the
Hmm.
ban. But I know that that is a very, that is obviously a very common saying, and I think, obviously what I think, a lot of, gun control advocates will say to that is, you know, Illinois does have a lot of strict laws, but there's also neighboring states that have guns like at crime scenes that, and guns that originated from neighboring states that end up on, on the streets of Chicago as well. Um, um, but then also there's an argument to be made about, you know, think of some of the ways that these guns end up on the streets. You have a lot of, you have police like to bring up straw purchasing. Straw purchasing, obviously, for your audience, is when somebody who is not allowed to own a firearm legally gets somebody they know who has a FOID card. And in order to get a FOID card, you can't have a felony conviction. That basically will disqualify you essentially from owning a
Mm.
firearm. They might get one of their friends who has a FOID card to get them guns. I mean, that's how um, street conflicts um you know have occurred, because we've seen that with straw purchasing. The thing is that those cases are pretty seldom prosecuted, on the state and federal. You don't really hear a lot of prosecutions for straw purchasing. I mean, there's not really you know I don't think that that's like an actual criminal charge, but like in terms of actually proving that, basically, illegal gun running or anything like that, or gun running is illegal, that's a redundancy, but you know what I mean. That's something like gun running, like is kind of like through straw purchasing. You hear of prosecutions from time to time, but it's not a regular thing.
Right.
What you do hear a lot is, and I know I'm going on a tangent here, but you do hear a lot of people in Chicago getting arrested for illegal gun possession. And there's two schools of thought there. You have the police who think, well, it's illegal to carry a gun if you're not allowed to own one, and if you don't have a FOID card and we catch you with a gun, that is a felony. But then you have a lot of criminal justice reformers. You have a lot of progressives who say, you know, certain communities in Chicago, particularly on the south and west side, African American communities in particular, are over policed, and when they pull people over, they're bound to find a gun. But it could be people carry guns, for a lot of different reasons. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're out to kill someone or out to shoot someone. And and the thing is that when so what a lot of progressives will say is that these aren't necessarily the people who are behind the violence. The people who
Yeah.
are actually shooting the guns are behind the violence. And if you look at statistics, you know it's it's under like 10% a year, of the clearance rate for like a non-fatal shooting, which is the most common form of gun violence in Chicago. So a lot of progressives will say that's what you really need to focus on, are people doing the shootings, not people who are carrying the illegal guns. So it's but yeah, I mean, I think it really depends on where these guns come from, how people get access to them. Sometimes that could be, a total mystery, especially because, you know, especially like with straw purchasing with police, which is what police emphasize a lot. We just don't see a lot of those cases being prosecuted, even though the police cite that as a big reason for illegal guns ending up on the street.
Hmm. Yeah. This is all very interesting. The subject is definitely going to be interesting to see play out, and I would love to have you back on to continue to talk about the developments. And please, no need for apologies on the tangents. That's what makes this podcast great. We can
Okay,
have
good.
a long form,
Yeah.
long form conversation with that nuance.
Yeah.
So, well, cool. I feel like we covered that subject. What are some other new laws that are coming into place? You mentioned indoor vape ban and other things.
Yeah. So yeah, vaping is no longer going to be allowed, in most indoor public places. This was an expansion. Several years ago, they had the Smoke Free Illinois Act, which basically banned traditional smoking from
Mm.
most indoor places. Yeah, so that was 16 years ago. So basically, use of electronic cigarettes, it's banned everywhere in Illinois, that places that use where combustible tobacco products, as they say, was not previously allowed. And so this will include within 15 feet of entrances to public buildings. So basically, wherever regular smoking is banned, so is vaping.
Yeah.
I think that there are some exceptions, like if you're in a tobacco shop and a big percentage of your business comes from e-cigarettes, well, then it's okay.
Yep.
But if it's from traditional places that we all know, like office buildings, restaurants, any sports arenas, whatever, it's banned.
And quick fun fact just for the audience, we've visited consumption lounges in the state in the past, and that's how they do it. They get a tobacco retailer's permit, and then uh like you say, there is a certain percentage of sales that has to be of those tobacco products, but you can be defined as not a public space, and
Right.
then therefore you would not fall under the Smoke Free Illinois Act.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Um, and then also some of these other laws too. So book ban. There was a law that addressed book bans. Um, so this really attracted a lot of attention, especially because of the partisan divides we're seeing across the country, Cole. So this was an initiative from Secretary of State Alexi Janulius. Um, Libraries, public libraries, which would include schools in Illinois, school libraries as well, would be cut off from state funding if they're found to have removed books and other materials from their shelves for, quote, partisan or doctrinal reasons. Um, and basically, this is a law, like I said, it comes as debates over book banning have intensified across the U.S. There's been a renewed discussion about censorship, school curricula, and how much say parents should have over what books are on library shelves. And Democrats on the state and national level say that book bans often discriminate against the LGBTQ plus community and other marginalized groups. Republicans have argued that some of these titles need to be out of the reach of children because they contain pornography or obscene imagery. And basically, what this law does is that, for your audience, if they're not aware, in addition to the Secretary of State running driver's facilities, to get your license renewed or a new driver's license, the Secretary of State is also the state librarian, which means that they provide grant funding for libraries across Illinois. So what this law does is that if they are found to have banned books, if they don't follow certain guidelines that are outlined in the statute, it's House Bill 2789 for anyone who wants to read the statute. I know that, that'll kind of tell you a little bit about it. Then the Secretary of State's office has the right to deprive these libraries of grant funding if they're seeking grant funding, basically. So we'll kind of see how that plays out as well. I mean, there's some Republicans who think that again, who don't know how this is going to work, especially because in the law the Democrats are following what's called the American Library Association's Bill of Rights. This is a national organization, it's been around for decades. And that's where the language about banning books for quote partisan or doctrinal end quote reasons comes from. Or these libraries can adopt their own policies that explicitly bar them from banning books. Um, so yeah, and then to in another question, a big question that came up. I mean, for Secretary of State Janulius was, this raises questions too, like to some people who don't know how the process works, is like, how do books end up in libraries to begin with? And you basically have library boards, you have school boards who make that determination as to what titles will end up on shelves. Janulius said that that process is not going to be interfered with. This process focuses on books that are already on the shelves, basically. So there's that as well.
It's interesting. I heard it, and I hate to say this because it confused me the first time, but it makes sense now. It's a ban on book bans.
Right. And it's a
Right?
ban on book bans, but I mean, I don't even know if I would say it's a ban on book bans. What it really is like, if you like, the way the law is written is that, if you're seeking grant funding, which Secretary
Hmm.
of State, dishes out millions, tens of millions of dollars each year in library grants,
Yeah.
for whatever improvements that the libraries need. If you want that and you are found to have banned books, then Secretary of
Yeah,
State.
like you say, it's like the board could choose. It's if it gets removed for those reasons. I see why you clarified that way.
Right. But I mean, I will say that I will leave you this a big question is going to be, how are they going to enforce it?
Sure.
Right. I mean, that's going to be, I think, something that everybody
Yeah.
is going to watch is how are you going to accuse a library of banning books if it, like what does that entail? So
Right.
I think that it's going to be an interesting 6 months to see how, or first 100 days, like with anything in government, to see how this plays out with that. Um, and I can keep going.
Yeah.
Another uh, Janulius initiative that made it through the legislature. Police will no longer be allowed to pull over motorists solely for having small objects such as air fresheners dangling from their vehicle's rearview mirror. This law basically seeks to prevent traffic stops for minor infractions that could be a pretext, to look for more serious offenses. Janulius's office has said that these stops obviously can be racially motivated and have the potential to lead to violent confrontations, between police and motorists. So that's another thing that that we're seeing. Um, and then, another thing as well, as far as I think I told you about this earlier, Cole, but not in this podcast, but like last week. The Secretariat, it's another initiative here related to the Secretary of State, is that this applies to people who've served time in prison. Um, the Secretary of State office, the Secretary of State's office will now issue identification cards to state prison or juvenile detention inmates if they provide, the appropriate documentation, a birth certificate, social security card, photograph, proof of residency. This is basically, for people who are incarcerated who are about to be released from prison, basically for landing on their feet. We've heard complaints, officials have said that there's been complaints that if somebody is incarcerated for a certain period of time, they may have an ID, but who knows? It could get lost in law enforcement may still have it. It could be lost somewhere in the chain of custody where, a detainee has to give up their belongings, or they've been incarcerated for an extended period of time, so much where their ID expired. So basically, an application must be submitted 60 days prior to their scheduled release from either IDOC or the Department of Juvenile Justice. And these two entities, for juveniles and adults, or for minors and adults, they must help people who are incarcerated, obtain this documentation. So that's another new law. I think another one too. Should I keep going?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
absolutely.
yeah,
Love
yeah.
it.
Another one. another one basically here. Oh yeah, so there's oh yes, okay, so there were laws that were passed pertaining to online harassment.
Mm,
So basically, anyone in Illinois who engages in doxing, and for those who don't know, doxing is basically when you share, um, when you go online and you share personal identifiable information about another person, um, to harm them or or harass them. Um, Anyone who engages in doxing can be found civilly liable. Um, you know, and basically what the statute says is that those people who could be found liable, um, are those who share information with reckless disregard, that the person to whom the information belongs, quote, would be reasonably likely to suffer death, bodily injury, or stalking. So that's one law. Another law related to online harassment that passed is anyone who is found to have altered image of someone else in a sexually explicit manner,
hmm
could also be subject to legal action, civil damages. That's a practice that's known colloquially as deepfake porn. This law is called the Digital Forgeries Act. This would grant plaintiffs financial reliefs in lawsuits if it's found that they falsely depicted somebody in this manner without their permission.
hmm
So there's that, and then you have uh, oh yeah, well, you also have minimum wage. Minimum wage for workers 18 and older went up by $1 to $14 an hour this year. So these are annual pay bumps, Cole. They result from a measure that Pritzker signed into law in 2019 when the
hmm
minimum wage was like 8.25 an hour. So the final increase is going to come next year when it reaches $15 an hour. So there's that. But some of the state, so like, Chicago, so like I know like Chicago, um, I think on July 1st, the minimum wage for employers that have 20 or more workers, went up like 15.80 an hour. So I mean, this is kind of what I mentioned before about the 14 an hour is kind of a statewide thing.
mm,
Um, or it is a statewide thing rather.
yeah,
And then you know, I'm just kind of going down the list here because this story was very long. It was
sure.
3,200 words. Um, oh yeah. So as we have you know, new casino, there's new casinos in the state in the
hmm
last couple of years, as you know. And there's a new measure. It's supported by state gambling regulators, and it basically holds that people convicted of felonies, um, previously were ineligible to hold any job in an Illinois casino, but there's a new law that allows people convicted of these crimes to be eligible for employment if these positions don't directly deal with betting.
Oh,
So people who have felonies on their record can work in casinos in like the food service sector or like housekeeping or maintenance. And obviously this comes as several new casinos have opened in the state, including in Chicago. And, this comes after, 2019, the big gambling expansion, which, you know, proponents say that it will provide more job opportunities in this industry in the state. Um, and then I can,
another big one that we talked about last week that I was pretty excited to read was that a measure that largely prohibits judges from ordering people to refrain from consuming alcohol or
right.
marijuana as a condition of probation, conditional discharge, or court supervision.
Yes. Yeah. So oftentimes, when any criminal defendant is charged with a crime, what judges do obviously is they impose certain restrictions on these defendants, and that includes, you know, prohibiting them from consuming marijuana or alcohol.
hmm
If they're convicted of, if their conviction is for, for is if they're sentenced to probation, conditional or court supervision, that's a pretty common thing. This law basically will allow judges to do that really in very specific cases. So I would imagine, here's an example. I would imagine, I'm not a lawyer, but I would think
Sure.
like if you are arrested and convicted of aggravated driving under the influence, where you're drunk driving and you crash into somebody and you seriously injure them, I would and say as part of the whatever sentence you get, um, you know, if it is, I don't know if it's a probationable offense, but I guess it might depend on bodily injury. I'm not, again, whatever, a criminal conviction like that. My point is that, drugs and alcohol were germane to the commission of that crime. So
Mm.
just pick any crime that you're sentenced to probation where drugs and alcohol were germane to that crime. That those are cases where a judge can um, basically impose a refrain of those substances, which are contingent on you staying on probation or, on court supervision. So there's that. Um, courts can still place restrictions on people under 21.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
and they can, they, a judge can still impose such restrictions on anyone under 21, and also participants in special programs called problem solving courts.
Mm.
So yeah, I mean, those are just some of the conditions where a judge is still allowed to order people from refraining from um, alcohol and marijuana. Um, and then also, speaking of that, I mean, since we're talking about like substance abuse, there were
Yeah.
also several measures that took effect that are aimed at addressing the opioid epidemic. Um, and so, particularly with fentanyl, of course, highly dangerous synthetic opioid contributes to many overdose deaths in Illinois, especially in the last decade. Um, so, like, one new law allows pharmacies and other retailers to sell fentanyl test strips over the counter. Um, and it's basically, it's a very important, um that's a very important thing for as a reduction strategy, because you know you know drug users oftentimes, if they ingest a certain drug, they don't know if fentanyl's in it, and that's how we've seen many overdoses and even deaths. So this basically, um you know the availability of these test strips allow users to basically detect that, whether it's present in other drugs. Another law allows trained overdose responders. These are, for organizations um, that are part of the Illinois Department of Human Services. They have a drug overdose prevention program. They're allowed to dispense drug adulterant testing supplies. This was something that only pharmacists and doctors and medical assistants were allowed to do in the past. And also, high schools will now be required to teach the dangers of fentanyl in every state required health course in high school, beginning in the fall. And, so the instruction on the dangers of fentanyl, it must come from federal agencies like the National Institutes of Health. This should include material about side effects and risk factors of fentanyl, how to detect the drug using test strips, and the roles of other opioid antagonists like Narcan, for instance. And then public and private schools in Illinois are also required to keep Narcan or some of these other opioid antagonists in a secure location, in you know in the event of an overdose. Previously, this was optional in schools. Now it's going to be mandatory.
I'm sorry, I was muted. Common Zoom mistake. Maybe we can wrap up with this last story, which at first I like misread it and I was like, wait a minute, what? It starts out with, and maybe you can take it from here. Illinois is repealing a portion of the 2013 law that legalized same-sex marriage. That's the part that I was like, wait a minute, where's this sentence going? Can you pick up where I left off there? Or I can.
Yeah. So
Cool.
so Illinois, they're repealing a portion of the same-sex marriage law that prohibited marriage licenses from being issued to same-sex couples from out of state if their state doesn't allow such unions to take place. So same-sex marriage it's been legal nationwide since the Obama years, since a 2015 Supreme Court ruling. Um, of course, at this time, we've seen that LGBTQ plus advocates, they're concerned about, this decision, after the high court last year, overturned the federal right to abortion under that were granted under Roe v. Wade. And in that concurring opinion, if you recall, Justice Thomas, he called for the court to reconsider other rulings, including the Supreme Court ruling that legalized same-sex marriage. So, basically, the previous law made it a Class C misdemeanor for a public official to issue a marriage license to couples who would not be permitted to wed under the laws of their home state. But that's been repealed, basically.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, Jeremy, folks that are listening, we're going to have this story linked. We covered actually most of the article, but I think there are some bases maybe we skipped over. So folks, I encourage you to read the full article by Jeremy Gorner. And is it Dan Petrella? Am I saying his last name right?
Dan Petrella, correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, we'll have it linked in the podcast description. We'll also have Jeremy's social media, like his Twitter, linked in case you want to follow Jeremy for his work. Jeremy, I gotta thank you for doing what you do to keep the public informed. Just on behalf of my listeners and on behalf of myself, somebody who reads your work, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I know I was rambling, but there was a lot there, Cole. So
No, it was perfect. And like I say, it's exactly what this podcast, I think it's what separates my podcast from other forms of media. The fact that we can take a deep dive and we can, go off on tangents and stuff. I think that's what makes it unique. I'd like to hope, at least. So
sure.
Well, folks, I hope you found as much value in this conversation as I did. Jeremy, I look forward to maybe catching up with you in the future on whatever you might be reporting on then. So
absolutely. And congratulations with everything, with the change, with the image change and everything. So
yeah. Hey, thank you so much. Thank you so much, folks. You take care.
All right.
Bye.